Now in Objective 6, we looked at the monomers of carbohydrates. In Objective 7, we're going to look at how the monomers and the polymers of carbohydrates relate to one another. Remember that a monomer is the single unit. A polymer is when we string monomers together, when we bind them together. So monosaccharides we learned about earlier, glucose, fructose, galactose, deoxyribose, and ribose, are the monosaccharides that we needed to learn earlier. Notice here in this table 2.6 from Tortora that it says that monosaccharides are simple sugars that contain from 3 to 7 carbon atoms, but for our purposes in this course we're only going to worry about the 5 carbon atom monosaccharides, the pentoses, and the 6 carbon atom monosaccharides, the hexoses. When we put 2 of the monosaccharides together, then we make disaccharides. When we add 2 monosaccharides together and form a small polymer, then we call that a disaccharide. Examples of disaccharides are sucrose, also called table sugar. That's a combination of the monosaccharide glucose and the monosaccharide fructose. When we bind glucose and fructose together, we make sucrose. When we bind glucose and galactose together, we make something called milk sugar or lactose. When we bind glucose and glucose together, we make something called maltose, which, as you might imagine, is found in malt, fermented grain. Polysaccharides are carbohydrate strings of many, many monosaccharides all put together. In animals, carbohydrates, especially those used for energy, are stored in a huge polysaccharide, in a huge polymer called glycogen. So in animals, glycogen is a bunch of glucose molecules all strung together into a complicated branch structure, a polysaccharide, a polymer of monosaccharides, or a sugar polymer. In plants, we don't usually see glycogen. In plants, glucose is stored in the form of starch. So carbohydrates are strung together into big, huge branch structures. And in plants, those are called starch. Starch is the main carbohydrate source in food. So food consists of some simple sugars, but also some starches. If we go back to that nutrition label, we'll see that on the nutrition label. Another form of carbohydrate, a polysaccharide, so a polymer of carbohydrates, which is not found in animals, but is found in plants, is cellulose. Cellulose is another name for a type of insoluble fiber. So if we go back to that nutrition label, we'll see insoluble fiber. And insoluble fiber is cellulose. We have organisms in our digestive tract that help to break down cellulose so that we can digest it. But a lot of the cellulose never gets digested, and so it becomes a lot of the bulk of feces that we excrete from the body. That's why we know it as insoluble fiber. So cellulose cannot typically be digested by humans, but it helps move food through the intestines. We know that fiber does that, so we use the terms cellulose and fiber interchangeably. Monosaccharides are examples of monomers of carbohydrates. Disaccharides and polysaccharides are polymers of carbohydrates. So we learned earlier that when a carbohydrate has 5 carbons, in other words, if it has the general formula C5H10O5, or with the exception of deoxyribose, which has the formula C5H10O4, either one having 5 carbons. So 5 carbons makes that a pentose. The pentoses are 5 carbon sugars, and in our course they're represented by ribose and deoxyribose. Ribose polymers make up a backbone of RNA. Deoxyribose polymers make up the backbone of DNA. Remember that RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So there are 5 carbons in each of these, but in deoxyribose, where there should be a hydroxyl group, there's a hydrogen atom there, and so it's C5H10O4. That's the difference between ribose and deoxyribose, but it's all the difference in the world. Luckily, the machinery inside of our body, the chemical machinery inside of our body that we'll learn about later, recognizes the difference between ribonucleic acid, or RNA, and deoxyribonucleic acid and DNA, and the only way that it knows these two molecules apart is through the presence or absence of a hydroxyl group or a hydrogen atom in the same location. Otherwise, these molecules are identical. And that's pretty amazing when you consider that we know the difference between two molecules just based on this one small change. The next group of carbohydrate monomers that we're going to look at are the hexoses. So this means that they have 6 carbon atoms. In each case, the formula is going to be C6H12O6, and that's why we call them hexoses. The first hexose we'll look at is glucose. Glucose is the major sugar found in blood. That's because cells prefer glucose as their energy source. So before they'll look at any other source of energy, and we'll see this again in Module 4, before they'll look at any other source of energy, they'll take in glucose as their energy source. In diseases such as diabetes, there's a disruption of the body's ability to control blood sugar. So a disruption in glucose control. Either hyperglycemia, too much glucose in the blood, or hypoglycemia, too low a glucose in the blood. Fructose also has the formula C6H12O6, which makes it a hexose. It's also called fruit sugar. Honey, for example, is 40% fructose, 30% glucose, 30% water, and other sugars. High fructose corn syrup is a synthetic sweetener that's made from corn and used in many foods, especially highly processed foods that we might find in a modern supermarket. Glucose is converted to fructose by enzymes, and high fructose corn syrup, for example, that which is used to sweeten soft drinks, is 55% fructose and 45% glucose. That's why we call it high fructose corn syrup. There's some controversial data that indicates that maybe the body doesn't metabolize high fructose corn syrup in the same way that it metabolizes other sugars, and that may be the problem with high fructose corn syrup. Of course, the high fructose corn syrup industry doesn't want you to know that, but just stay tuned because there's a lot of interest in the effects of high fructose corn syrup on human health. Whether there is something there or not, we don't know yet, but it's certainly something which is controversial and is being extensively studied. Galactose is the last of the carbohydrate monomers that we're going to look at in Objective 9. Galactose, again, is C6H12O6, and C6H12O6 in this case makes the structure shown here. We find galactose in dairy products and also in sugar beets, and if we combine this with glucose into a disaccharide, we call that disaccharide lactose, which is milk sugar.